The European Union (EU) is facing a dilemma in its relations with China, one of its major trading partners and geopolitical rivals. On one hand, the EU wants to cooperate with China on areas such as trade and investment. On the other hand, the EU is alarmed by China's support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which they see as threatening the security and stability of Europe. The EU has imposed sanctions on Russia and called for its withdrawal from Ukrainian territory, but China has proposed a peace plan that would, according to them, legitimize Russia's aggression and undermine Ukraine's sovereignty. EU is also concerned about China's so-called human rights violations, its assertive behavior in the Indo-Pacific region, as well as its support for Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The EU is divided on how to respond to China's growing influence and alignment with Russia, with some member states favoring a more assertive approach and others preferring a more pragmatic one. The EU aims to recalibrate its China policy and find a balance between engaging and confronting Beijing, while reaffirming its close political and cultural relationship with the United States. The European Union has been one of the main actors in the international response to the crisis in Ukraine, which began in 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia. These sanctions target diplomatic, economic, and sectoral sanctions, as well as individual sanctions targeting persons and entities responsible for or involved in the destabilization of Ukraine. The EU has also suspended bilateral dialogues and cooperation agreements with Russia and restricted its access to certain technologies and markets. The EU's sanctions are designed to increase the costs of Russia's actions and to persuade it to respect international law and the Minsk agreements, which aim to end the violence and restore peace in Ukraine. The EU's sanctions have had a significant impact on Russia's economy and political isolation, but they have not deterred it from continuing its destabilizing actions in Ukraine. Moreover, the sanctions have pushed Russia closer to China, which has provided it with alternative sources of financing, trade, and investment. China has also opposed the EU's sanctions on Russia, calling them illegal and counterproductive, and has urged the EU to respect Russia's legitimate interests and sovereignty. The EU is worried that China's support for Russia could undermine its efforts to resolve the crisis in Ukraine peacefully and diplomatically. The EU fears that China could exploit the divisions within the bloc and weaken its unity and solidarity. Therefore, the EU is concerned about the role of some Chinese companies in supporting Russia's economy, despite the sanctions imposed by the EU and its allies. The EU believes that these companies are undermining the effectiveness of the sanctions and enabling Russia to continue its aggressive actions in the region. So the EU wants to appeal to Xi Jinping, the president of China, to stop various Chinese firms from helping Russia over the sanctions imposed by the EU and the West. The EU hopes that by engaging with China constructively and respectfully, it can persuade it to adopt a more balanced and responsible approach, or an approach that they desire towards Russia and Ukraine. The EU hopes that by appealing to Xi Jinping, it can foster a more constructive dialogue with China and address the common challenges that both sides face. However, the EU also faces the challenge of balancing its relations with China and its alliance with the United States, which has adopted a more confrontational approach towards China under the Biden administration. The US has been pressuring the EU to take a tougher stance on China and to join its efforts to counter China's influence and assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific region. The US has also expressed concerns about the EU's Comprehensive Agreement on Investment CAI with China, which was signed in December 2020 after 7 years of negotiations. The CAI aims to improve market access and create a level playing field for European and Chinese investors, but it has been criticized for being too lenient on China's labor and environmental standards, and for undermining the transatlantic coordination on China policy. The EU plans to proceed with its demand through various channels and platforms, such as high-level dialogues, summits, joint statements, and declarations. The EU will also highlight the benefits of working together on global challenges such as climate change. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and be sure to take a moment to subscribe.